Hi, Jen.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, I'm good, thank you. Set up here. And then my computer's doing some funny thing that it says I have to install Zoom. I'm on Zoom, but,
Weird.
but I have this weird installation in progress
Oh,
image. Yeah, it's so bizarre. Like, whatever.
that's so, that's very, I've just had it where I was at another meeting, I was in our faculty meeting and
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
not the host. And I
Right.
was trying to switch to my phone so I could go for a walk because it was sunny here for a minute.
Oh,
And it was like, do you want to end the meeting? And I was like, because you're the host. I was like, no, I'm not the host, but I want to leave the house.
yeah.
I was like, I'm just
That's
gonna close my
funny.
computer and walk away and hopefully it'll be
Oh.
fine. I was like, no, don't make me stay here.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Is
thought
it
about
least
signing in, and I was like, that's all right. I'm gonna forego.
is it least sunny? Is it sunny in LA? I'm
It's
assuming.
very sunny. It's very sunny and warm, actually.
Oh,
So, and I just traveled in from Boston last night and then got on a plane right when I landed to come to LA. So it's been quite a whirlwind, but the weather is great. So that's a huge consolation. I feel so much more awake.
yeah.
So it's great.
So this is your first spring in Seattle, right?
It is, yeah. So I'm really looking forward to it. It's beautiful so far. I do like it a little bit warmer, I'm not gonna lie, but it's okay.
This is not the typical spring. Like we should all be in short sleeves and
Oh, really? Is
yeah,
it
this
usually
is
a bit warmer?
not
Oh,
normal. Right.
oh, here, I'll shut my door so I don't have background noise.
Hi, Karina. Hi, Anya. I'm like, Anya, would you agree this is not a typical spring?
No, but it's really sunny right now.
Oh, good.
Looking out at the office.
Good.
Oh, that's always nice. Yeah, I'm okay as long as I have sun, I find. It's when I don't have sun that it gets a bit.
Yeah, it's been abnormally cold, I would say.
Yeah, it has been in Seattle, I heard. It's not typical. Normally it's like the weather we're having here right now in LA. A little bit
Really? Wow.
warm with a little bit of sun and a little bit of drizzle in the morning, or in the evening, but that's about it.
Oh, that's great.
We get this like fake summer. It's like the May is like the fake out where it gets really nice, and then June it retreat. Everyone's like gets really sad because it totally goes away, and then in July it comes back. Then we're good to go.
Oh, okay. Because yeah, I think we came over in June and then I went to the East Coast shortly after. But I remembered it was not as warm as I thought it would be in June.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah.
still 60s. Yeah,
Yep. Total fake out. Yeah.
that's funny.
Anya, how are we doing with folks joining?
We have 8 people in the waiting room right now.
Okay.
Whenever you want me to admit them.
Awesome. I think we can go ahead. I'll get to the screen share up and going so we can they'll come into that. So that should be there. Yeah, why don't you go ahead and let folks in?
Okay.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just another minute. Karina, should we go ahead and get started? So we're like 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Okay.
That sounds great.
Great. I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Big Heart series. a joint effort between Center for AIDS Research and the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington. Today, we're really excited to have Dr. Michelle Johnson-Jennings, who is a recently new arrived faculty at the University of Washington with a joint appointment in the School of Public Health, and her primary home at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington School of Social Work. I'm honored and privileged to call her my Choctaw sister, and have had a chance to work with her off and on for what, 20 years, I think, Michelle. Just a little bit about her background, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jen in a second. Jen, did you want to say anything before I start introducing Michelle formally?
No, go ahead. I can say when I turn over. Go for it.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Dr. Michelle Johnson-Jennings is a enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and she is currently the professor. She's a professor and director of environmentally based health and land-based healing at IRRI. That's what we call Indigenous Wellness Research Institute. She received her doctoral degree in counseling psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a master's degree in education from Harvard University, where she specialized in human development and psychology and contemporary Native issues. She has also held the Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Community Engaged Research. Prior to coming to the University of Washington, she was on faculty in the Community Health and Epidemiology and Medicine, and associate professor in Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. And there she was the scientific director of the National Indigenous HIV/AIDS Center at the University of Saskatchewan. So this is one of the reasons why we're excited about having her here. Somewhere in her career path, many years ago, she was an Indigenous HIV/AIDS research trainee and scholar through HART at IRRI back in the early days. And I think she's going to touch upon that a little bit today. Prior to her appointment at University of Saskatchewan, she was at University of Minnesota, and a little bit about her therapeutic expertise. She's works with our Indigenous communities, primarily on decolonizing healing and rewriting narratives through trauma through land-based healing. And she's partnered with international and national organizations, worked very closely, had a Fulbright to New Zealand, working with our Maori colleagues there. And she brings all of that to her storing her life and expertise today. She also founded and directed the Research for Indigenous Community Health Center, RICH, at the University of Minnesota. So we're really excited to have her here at the University of Washington. And without much further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Jen if there's anything else that you would like to say. And then I know Dr. Johnson-Jennings has an introduction she normally would like to give. Finally, I'd just like to, before we move forward, one last thing, is I want to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the land and the lands that we're in. I recognize that all of you are in Indigenous lands right now, so if you can take a moment and just acknowledge those in your heart and mind. And I know I'm acknowledging the Tongva people. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, and we also acknowledge where the UW sits on the Indigenous lands of the Coast Salish people, primarily the Duwamish and other tribal communities of the land there. And okay, yeah, I'm just going to turn it to you, Jim. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Karina, and welcome everyone. Just briefly before we turn it over to our speaker for today, I think many of you have joined us for prior sessions, but just wanted to highlight some of the opportunities with the Big Heart program. So Dr. Walters and I are collaborating on this between CFAR and IRRI, and we have multiple different opportunities for mentorship for our scholars with Indigenous HIV researchers, and our goals are to connect folks through these settings here and as well as other opportunities. And stay tuned, because actually next month we're going to be having a networking opportunity for folks to meet and talk with other researchers with UW, Fred Hutch, and across Seattle who are working in HIV science, and have a networking event for that. And we'll also be sharing information from that about potential internships and job opportunities. And for those of you who attended multiple sessions, we want to extend the opportunity. And I know Anya's reached out to several folks who have for Indigenous scholars to attend the annual Principles of STI and HIV Research and Public Health Practice course. This is a world-renowned course that really focuses on the foundations and sort of kind of the cutting edge research in this area, brings folks from all over the world. It's predominantly virtual, but we'll be having some in-person and live activities as well. So it's in, I believe it's 30th year, and it's a really great, kind of incredible learning opportunity, and we'd love to support folks with that. So for more information about any of the events we have, there's the link below, and you can register to become a Big Heart Fellow. With that, I will want to turn it over to Dr. Johnson-Jennings. Actually, one more thing before I do that is just to remind folks, we kind of do this upfront so we can save all time for presentation and discussion, is that our June panel is actually our elders and practitioners panel with a phenomenal list of speakers, including Pamela Jumper-Thurman, Anthony Stately, Sharon Day, and Tommy Chesbrough. So really, all of the events are not missed. And I think this one in particular, to hear the stories and experiences from folks who've worked in the field of HIV for many decades. So with that, I will stop sharing and we'll turn it over to Michelle. Michelle, do you have slides today that we can share? Or you should be,
I do,
okay.
yes.
Hopefully you should be good to go.
Just try to, it is not accessing my computer, so let me try this again. Just hold on one second. For some reason, my computer turned off some sharing privileges, so I'll just do that right now. But thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much, Dr. Walters, for the wonderful introduction. Do you see my slides? No.
Not yet.
Have we enabled sharing privileges?
Let me see if this works. You know, and if we don't, that's okay too. I just had, I can share my desktop. So maybe if I pull up my slides on my desktop, it would work. I'm not sure why, for some reason it's not.
Now we can see your desktop now.
Okay, great. Well, let me just pull up my PowerPoint again. Looks like it closed out. Pay now attention to my messy desktop. All right. That look okay on your end?
Yep, that's it. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, we'll just go with it. I always have these technology problems, it seems. So I feel like my computer gets a bit stressed at times, but we'll just go with it. And today, you know, I just wanted to talk to you about Indigenous well-being and gender rebalancing, and really about my path in getting to HIV/AIDS research. And, you know, I really appreciate the land acknowledgement as well. And I would just like to also acknowledge our relations that we bring into the room with us today, that being our ancestors that I carry with me, your ancestors that you carry with you, and as well as our ancestors upon the lands in which we are situated. I like to give just an overview of who I am as an Indigenous researcher. And I'm Choctaw, so I'll say halito sa Michelle Johnson-Jennings, Michain and Kishapokuna, Choctaw Siohoke, Stikpa Aba Oma Aya Dok. So I'm from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. You can see me in the top of the screen, sitting on one of my great grandmother's laps with my siblings. And I hail from the mountains of Oklahoma, which are pretty small in comparison to the Rockies and the ones that are in Washington as well. So it's not a huge mountainous region, Oklahoma, but we did have some mountains. And my Choctaw Nation community has really shaped who I am today. Really, you know, I'm very fortunate because I was in the first cohort of HART Fellows back in the day, and really got to get my feet wet with HIV/AIDS research through the training program, which was wonderful, and really focusing on what I could do to assist where I could. And that did lead to the Winooska HIV/AIDS Research Center, in which we focus on gender rebalancing. I just put up there that I'm a full professor because for some reason, I think when I speak about kind of this lava land-based healing, I get a lot of questions if I just graduated or if I'm a PhD student. I don't think it's my youthful look. So I think some of the information I'll be talking to you about today was, we'll talk more about how it's seen within science and how perhaps it's rendered as not quite as valid as other approaches or research methods. But all in all, I would like to say, I am a storyteller. That's my family in the lower right. So those are all my kiddos. I have 4 children that I birthed, and my partner there, Dr. Derek Jennings. And I always like to say I've always been part of a gang. You see him on my big wheeler in the middle there. And part of the reason I say this is because my siblings have really shaped who I am as well, and been a great source of support and keeping me grounded. But as well, University of Washington, I have a great gang of Indigenous research scientists that are phenomenal, who have mentored and guided me throughout my career, which have really given me a lot of firm footing, with my sister, Dr. Karina Walters, being one of those, for sure. So if I could just take a moment, because I'm not on presenter view, I'm just going to make sure I don't go over here. But I just want to tell you a quick story about Patnakvila. And this is actually a Choctaw story that was told to me originally by one of my friends and their grandmother. But we've kind of shifted it just a little bit. And Dr. Walters and I have published this in an upcoming chapter that'll be coming out. But if you'll just bear with me for a moment, I'm going to talk to you about Patnakvila, which is that tornado-looking shape that you see on the screen there. So Patnakvila came about to be because a long time ago, they say that there was 2 children who were orphaned, who were Choctaw. And the elder sister cared for her brother. She hunted and provided their food so that they could eat. And they were well. They were doing quite well together as they cared and took care of one another, or so they say. And then one day the sky darkened. The sister failed to return home from her hunt. Then the clouds came and the skies roared, and in nearby lands they watched the whirlwind come and cause great devastation to the villages. Or so they say, that the boy grew so worried about his sister that he set off to find her. After several nights, he heard someone crying in a nearby tree. As he climbed up to the hollow, he found his beloved sister. "Go away and be safe," she scolded him. He begged her to come home, but she could not. She explained that during her last hunting expedition, she had been assaulted by neighboring villagers. In her all-consuming rage, she transformed into the whirlwind of Patnakvila and took revenge on the men and others. She begged her brother to flee as she would turn into the whirlwind again. He asked her to come home, as he loved her, and he couldn't make it without her, but she refused. And she said she was now going to be known as a Patnakvila. But she did transfer onto him her hunting skills. She said, "Don't worry, you'll be able to take care of yourself now." Well, they say that the boy frequently visited his sister, bringing her gifts of food during the day. While his sister raged over the lands, he became known as the best hunter in the village and readily shared his meat with all who were around him. But then as his reputation spread, he was welcomed as a potential son-in-law to many communities. He visited his sister and shared the news of his success with her. He asked her if she needed anything, and she said that she was lonely and wished that she too could have a partner. He offered to find her a partner. He met with a maternal uncle of a prospective wife and asked for this woman's hand in marriage. The prospective wife agreed to the marriage, but when they left the village, he told her the truth, that he was hoping she would marry his sister, who is the whirlwind, a Patnakvila. The prospective wife agreed, as long as she could meet her and determine for herself if they were a loving match. A Patnakvila and her betrothed met, and they agreed to marry. Over time, she and her beloved wife grew a strong partnership, and through love, a Patnakvila was able to transfer her pain and heal. And as she healed, a Patnakvila's power of whirlwind transformed, into restoring balance with the earth, turning up vegetation and land, and instead not focusing just on destruction and pain. One day her brother visited and she told him to tell others to place tobacco outside their home so that she would miss their homes when she came through to rebalance the earth. From this day forward, this is why we use chuma or tobacco to put out during a tornado, or so they say, Yomiho. Now, I tell this story, which I really think is about transformation of trauma and rebalancing after times of hardship. Let me just see if I can close this out here. There we go. Rebalancing, can come after trauma. It also, illustrates our stories. And I think it's really important anytime that I give a talk. We as Choctaw people are our storytellers. And it creates space for ancestral knowledges, really. And to us, that's really important. But these stories also hold the instructions for help. And they center our identity and our ancestral knowledge around trauma and interrelationships, right? And so we can look at something such as trauma, and it gives us a narrative in which we can transform that through love. In particular, that women are respected and sacred, that when we upset the balance of these sacred relationships, it causes these huge reactions upon the earth, and that we all will feel responsible for them. We will feel the wrath of what is to become or the consequences of those behaviors. But relational restoration is key within this process, and we need to find this balance for health. These teachings also require sacrifice. Just as the brother had to give up his betrothed, he had to first find, he wanted to, and sacrifice to find his sister first, someone that she could partner with, and giving thanks and renewal through this love, which is really important. Now, through a Western colonial framework, it's quite different. I describe, I'm an integrated primary care psychologist. My specialty was health psychology in my training program. And the first thing, I ask patients as they walk in was not what their ancestors have gifted them with or what ancestral stories they may have, but really what their ancestors have cursed them with, right? So when you walk into a clinic, you'll be asked, have your ancestors cursed you with diabetes? Have they cursed you with cancer risks? Have they cursed you with heart disease risk? And it's more about what have they done to you instead of what have they done for you. And that's very colonial, right, as we go through this process. Whereas instead, women and their love in particular is not held as sacred. Illnesses arise from individual negative experiences, right, or interactions with pathogens. And then, of course, a healing is void of context. It's not relational, which is what usually occurs with our Indigenous communities and our healing practices. And all in all, feminizing love is often rendered as unscientific and unmeasurable. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go along. But just to briefly mention, we know that Indigenous communities have experienced much historical trauma. I'm sure in your other talks this has also been discussed. But just to remind you that this is massive historical trauma. My story did center on individual trauma, which is a bit different in terms of its effect upon all the community members. Now, when we talk about Panakvila, of course, the community was affected through the tornadoes, right? And through the devastation to the land and loss of life and this wrath and this anger that would come out. So there was consequences. But historical trauma refers to when a whole community experiences this trauma, and then it has lasting, lifelong effects across generations. And we have many scholars who have delved into this. Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart first talked about, I think, in the 1990s, but then, Dr. Walters and Dr. Evans Campbell right here at University of Washington have done a lot of work looking at how this influences health and health practices across generations as well. And for myself, thinking about our Choctaw ways of being and our Choctaw stories, I really see this trauma as disrupting our connection to our cultural continuity, our ability to be Choctaw, our ability to be Indigenous, and our ability to have these wise and healthy practices to the land. And furthermore, through trauma, we become invalidated, not only marginalized and relegated as invisible in a lot of instances, but also that our knowledges do not matter. Now, in terms of HIV risk factors, I started off looking at chronic pain when I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. That was really my focus. I actually wanted to do neuropsychology when I got done with my PhD or was training within it, I should say. And then through our residency for the year after, so our programs are 5 years, but that's 5 years post-master's. So I had a non-clinical master's in human development psychology. So I had to add on an additional 2 years to first get my clinical master's, and 7 years total. And in the last year, you do a residency at a site or two, depending on what your assignment is. But nonetheless, I went in and very excited to start developing more culturally relevant diagnostic measures around mental health and well-being, and really looking forward to this. And once I arrived at the clinic, I was told, nope, our issue is chronic pain. We need more help in handling chronic pain and managing it. And we also want you to help us with the prescription drug misuse that's occurring in the community. And this is a number of years ago. And as I started looking more into it, I saw that, pain is actually related to, of course, colonization, right? The more structural racism you have, systemic racism, oppression, marginalization, your loss of self-determination, not only increases your vulnerability to other chronic disease risk, but especially HIV risk factors, according to Allen and Smiley, but it also increases your pain levels. And when we talk about pain, it's a very subjective experience. So I can't tell you how much pain I'm in, and you can't really understand, right? Because it's different. And if you're more stressed, you're going to feel more pain. If you don't have social supports and outlets, you're going to feel that pain more. So I always kind of smile when I see those scales of how much pain are you in, 0 to 10? Because then even if I said 10, as you look at the research, you'll know that a lot of providers actually don't believe the patient. And so when they ask me, I can't help but ask them, will you actually believe me with what I tell you? Because it is a very subjective experience. It also, HIV risk factors also increase with imbalance. And in particular, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the center we were able to develop in Canada, but gender imbalance. So I told you the story of Panakvila, and a lot of people didn't realize we had any two-spirit, or what people would call two-spirit stories in our culture. But a lot of those stories aren't being told today through colonization, right? And also our gender roles have really changed through colonization. So for instance, one of my huge pet peeves going way back has always been the word hatak, which means a person in our language. So it's used as hatak hatak. But then through colonization, somehow it became man. And then women were called something else. And we have no gender pronouns in our language. So there's not a he or she. We refer to people as a general gender, I suppose, like they or them. And that resonates with me. So I always feel a little bit odd when asked what my pronouns are, because to me, it doesn't quite culturally make sense. Or something that I constantly think about in those terms. I think of gender roles, being a mother, gender roles of what I would do at this moment, or, if I want to do something else that's a little bit outside of one role or the other. It was commonly accepted, right? I could wear whatever clothes I want. I could do different activities, and I guess, back in the day, they call me a tomboy, but it was not quite the same. And so not the same as in Western views of gender. And so this imbalance also puts us at risk, right? Because we feel like we don't have the support and the stability to act freely upon our relationships in which ways that we are. There's also an imbalance with wellness, of course, within our communities, and that increases our risk factors. Now, in particular, I mentioned to you that I was asked to work in a clinic and really focus on opiate overdoses, and to focus on opiate misuse and how we could reduce those risks. We know that Indigenous people are 50% more likely to die of an overdose. Well, I was working in a clinic setting. We had some providers who would hand out prescriptions readily at the drop of a hat. You walk in, you say, if you have any type of pain, they were there to give you a prescription. Then I had other ones who said, I am not giving them a prescription because they were in here last week and I know they weren't in pain last week because they didn't mention it. And now today they're telling me they can't function. I really don't believe them. And so they believe they're malingering. And so I would be called in to assess further. And what I would find is across the board, and there have been other studies as well that have examined this, that Indigenous people, will present with one symptom for a doctor's appointment. And in fact, you're told you can only come in for one symptom. And then when it mentioned the other, especially chronic pain, until it's debilitating. So though they may be in pain, they don't feel at liberty to discuss it. And then once it's debilitating, it's often dismissed even further. In 2022, after the pandemic, there have been researchers that said we've had a 5-fold increase in prescription overdose rates as well, which is really disheartening to hear. And I know the pandemic has been a further stressor for a lot of our communities for substance use across the board, but in particular for Indigenous communities that didn't have a lot of resources or access to care. So when I was an HART fellow, we started this project, and I hate to admit it took us quite a few more years to publish it, but we were able to work with the honors project of Dr. Walters and look at how racial discrimination influenced pain. So we already knew from Che and Walters that racial discrimination would influence pain rates. And my team and I wanted to look at whether or not pain would actually increase smoking rates. And because we know that if you're a smoker, you also have increased sensitivity to pain. So we presumed it would be this feedback loop, right? So the more discrimination you have, the more pain you're going to have, the more pain you're going to have, the more smoking you're going to have, the more smoking you have, the more pain you're going to have. And so it's more difficult to stop and to cease some of these behaviors, right? So as we started looking more into the literature, what we saw was both racism and increased homophobia experienced in the mainstream culture by those who referred to themselves as Two-Spirit or LGBTQ as well. But then also the tobacco company really targeted not only Indigenous communities at large, and you can read through the release of the documents, and I forget what year that was, in the 2000s, and we can see how they purposefully targeted Indigenous communities to get them hooked on cigarettes, and that increased smoking risk. But they also purposely targeted anything they saw as Two-Spirit areas as well, because they wanted to increase addiction to cigarettes in those communities. Now, we also saw that, if you have HIV/AIDS positive status, you also have higher smoking risks. And for overall health, that's not great to hear, right? Because we know smoking increases so many health risks at the same time. And there is an additive risk, right? If you have intergenerational effects of historical trauma, we know that'll also increase your risk of addictions, as well as if you have pain, of course, you'll have an increased addiction risk because typically people are trying to self-medicate. And in our study, we found the majority of the Two-Spirit populations sampled suffered from pain, chronic pain. And then the daily smoking rates were also higher than for Two-Spirit individuals as compared to US, American Indian, Alaska Native smoking rates, which are also among the highest. So as we were looking at this, and I was thinking about this more in terms of my own career progression and thinking about chronic pain and addiction risks and what we can do to help lower these risks and overall improve HIV management, but also to lower HIV risk as well. We saw that there was a relationship to how one identified and pain-related impairment. And what we saw was those who identified as gay or lesbian, they had 49% endorsement of pain-related impairment, 59.7% of those who identified as bisexual, 60% of those who identified as Two-Spirit. And with these, we weren't as surprised because we presume the more racial discrimination you have, or the more you identify as being Indigenous, which is where we rationalize perhaps when someone calls themselves Two-Spirit, that would be more connected to their culture, they would experience more discrimination, which would then increase your pain as well. but then also those who refer to themselves as heterosexual, but also had same-sex relationships, their pain rates were incredibly high, 82.8%. As well as other, and we're not quite sure, someone was able to select other. So, I started wondering, well, does pain increase, with increased stigma on how we refer to ourselves in terms of sexual orientation or gender? And this got me thinking, right? Because I'm not two-spirit, but at the same time, I know for myself, gender has been really colonized within Indigenous cultures. And for myself, I wouldn't say that I would be extreme in one gender category or another for sure. But at the same time, I know that there's a lot of unhealthiness through colonization and how we view gender. And but we need all of us together to be healthy. We all have to have our roles to play within our communities and our society, and we have to honor each other to function fully and to be healthy. Now, I started thinking a lot too about these prescription drug overdose rates. So I know that Indigenous people experience among the highest chronic pain rates compared to anyone else, especially in the US, and I would say in Canada as well. But as we think about all of this pain, I mean, it makes sense, right? With the discrimination, with the higher rates of violence against Indigenous people, over 80% of people have experienced some type of violence committed upon them. Majority, I think it's like 89% is by non-Indigenous people committing the violence. So we definitely have high rates of victimization, high rates of trauma. So that would also increase our risk for addiction, our risk for experiencing chronic pain. But I also found that as we looked at national data sets, again, this is a study that took, I think, 5 or 6 years to end up publishing. But as we were looking at this, we saw that those who experience increasing levels of chronic pain increase their misuse of prescription medications. And then as their pain plateaued to a higher level, their prescription drug misuse rates fell. So even though Indigenous groups had very high rates of prescription drug misuse, higher than most, as their pain got extreme, that misuse rate fell. And we believe that's because that's when they finally went into a clinic and got some assistance perhaps at that point, or they were able to take care of their pain in other ways. We're not quite sure, but we do know that perhaps prescription drug misuse is really just under treatment of chronic pain. And so that was really important for myself to see as a researcher and to understand that, addiction is very complicated, and a lot of times misuse may be just self-treatment for actual physical maladies as well. Now, I was in Canada for 4 years, and when I moved there, I was just flabbergasted at the rate of HIV that was occurring within the province I was in. I was in Saskatchewan, right there in the middle. Fabulous university that recruited me for a couple of years. First, I kept saying no, and then I admitted to them I didn't really know where Saskatoon, Saskatchewan was in relationship to where I was, and they were doing some wonderful work indigenizing from the president level down. And everyone had to indigenize every course across the university. It didn't matter if you taught statistics, math, psychology, history, everything had to be indigenized. And so I was really fortunate to be able to come in and to work with a lot of fabulous colleagues who are working in that direction. But at the same time, there's still really high disparities, especially in terms of HIV cases. You can see Saskatchewan leads the nation at 15.5 rate of HIV diagnosis per 100,000 in 2017, which is right when I arrived there. And Indigenous people represent the majority, of those, I should say a major group of those cases. So they're only 4.9% of the population, but 24.3% of all HIV cases. With this data, what we were able to see was that injection drug use was reported by 67% of the new cases. And there were also very high rates of chronic pain as well. And what we know is that a lot of drug cartels would actually target reservation communities, same within the US. and at first offer prescription drugs, opiates, that as clinics have become more restrictive on prescribing those, they're highly, highly addictive. They're made to be addictive as well. So there's been lawsuits about that. It's actually asked to work on some cases with that. And luckily, you know, people were able to settle, and tribes have been on the forefront of garnering some justice around the opiate crisis that's been occurring. But the same as in Canada, the drug cartels would show up with these syringes of really potent heroin, and they would sell them for $20, whereas one pill would cost you $60 on the street. So as the prescription drugs were more restricted, heroin became more readily available, and definitely targeting the reservations to help distribute this drug across. So what we learned was that you had a lot of cases of Hep C as well, and a lot of spread within certain communities, and quite readily there was rampant spreading. Now, it mainly in Canada, especially in Saskatchewan, was occurring among heterosexual females, actually. So a lot of work around mother and child bonding. In fact, I was really privileged to be part of a project in which they, instead of removing an infant who was born to a mother who was addicted to opiates, and they started encouraging rooming in, and lo and behold, the child did not have the fetal effects right after birth like the other infants did if they were allowed to stay with their mother. And then we also were able to start projects in which we work with moms in attachment parenting and keeping them with their children, but also looking at how we can integrate land-based healing, getting them outdoors with their child, getting them to bond outside with their child, and to really get back to those ancestral practices, which in turn, you know, would help them feel more responsible to help get to change some health behavior and be healthier for their child in the long run. So it's very satisfying to see that work being done there by my colleagues. I think also in the US, you know, as you look at this, you know that we have really high stats for HIV and Hep C, both of them, right? We know that Indigenous males have higher rates compared to white males. We know Indigenous females have higher rates as well. Hep C is the highest among Indigenous people in the US. And so, you know, those high health disparities, though, you know, I hate to focus on the negative within our communities. At the same time, I think it's important to know where we're having failings through our society and how we can help improve care for all. So while I was thinking through what could be done in Canada, I was really fortunate to link up again with some great colleagues who are working in this area as well. And we started thinking about how it influences gender, how gender relates to HIV risk in particular. Again, we know that females were 97% of all cases, 84% were childbearing age. We know that females were much younger as well. We know that two-spirit communities also face increased odds. Again, you know, homophobic discrimination, cultural social isolation, increased vulnerability, lots of work being done in the area about the risks, but not as much work yet being done on what would prevent these risks and what would help heal. And so where I've had the great privilege is looking at how, you know, considering historical trauma and present trauma and how that influences addiction rates, because we know that it certainly increases addiction rates, right? Like, so the more historical trauma you have in your background, the more at risk you are. And there's people who have looked at actually how it affects our genetic phenotypic expression. And it doesn't mean that our genes are defective by any means, but we know that even when you have people who experience the Dutch famine, Irish potato famine, you know, it's not just Indigenous people, but when you have massive historical trauma occurring within a community, those offspring several generations after actually have these switches that turn on within their body. So for instance, your body says it's a hostile world. We need to protect ourselves as much as we can. So when a woman becomes pregnant, also when a man provides semen for a child as well, same thing happens. The child will be born with increased risk for addiction if this switch is turned on. It doesn't mean they're going to be addicted for sure, but there's an increased risk, right? And it's just a switch. So there's something happening that says to the child and the future offspring, do this to survive in this hostile world. But we know through twin studies, through Dr. Nora Valkow, that when twins are separated at birth, the twin that goes to the loving, supportive home and the twin that goes to a less supportive, loving home, they both have the same switches turned on. So risk for addiction and ill health, chronic disease, obesity, diabetes, etc. at birth. But then the one in the loving, supportive home, by age 5, no longer has those risks. The switches have all been turned off. But then the one that's in the less loving, supportive home still does into adulthood. So as you think about these switches getting turned on, I think we have to also balance that with, they could be turned off with love, right? So we can help prevent addiction risk. We can help prevent ill health risk, HIV risk, through loving, supportive environments. And also there's quite a bit of work being done around how cultural activities, traditional healing practices can also reduce these risks, which I think is really great. It really goes back to our ancestral practices though, right? So as a Choctaw, I was told we never hit a child. And most Indigenous communities, as we look into it, never hit children, right? You don't yell at them, you don't hit them, you treat them with this love. And I think that's really important because this love is what our ancestors have taught us to do, because they knew, I truly believe they're really wise scientists back in the day, and they knew that through love, we could help keep those good switches on, right, for the children, or turn off those that might put us more at risk later on. And it's really through, transforming these narratives of trauma, or transforming the trauma. And I put on her Ochosh, and that's, I used to think it was like a cuss word and chalked up, but Ochosh is to call upon the ancestors to help us, right, to help guide us. And that's what it refers to. But it's really about going back to those loving practices, just like in Apanakvila, the story I told you, right? The brother goes back to his sister again and again. He feeds her, through the actual story. That was a very condensed version, but through the actual story, he goes back again and again and sacrifices for her and gives her food, and just really pleads with her to come back into community, right? And then helps her through a loving instance and gesture. So as we think about that, I really think that can be done. And my work is really taking me to think more about how we can get back to this love of our ancestors through land-based practices and land-based healing. But to do so, we really have to think about how to indigenize. And again, I mentioned I was at the University of Saskatchewan, very much about indigenizing and decolonizing. But I think sometimes people think decolonizing is the same thing as indigenizing. And it's really not. Like, one step is to decolonize, right? To really look through, how do we see gender? How do we see health and well-being? What has been a result of trauma? What has been a result of colonization? And then we start creating space, right? Dr. Linda Tui Weiss-Smith talks about this. We got to create space for the indigenizing. And it's through this indigenizing that we're then able to build up and go back to those ancestral practices and let control remain with the community and how they see it and how they want to proceed. Now, I just want to give this caveat. Again, I am not Two-Spirit, so I refer to my colleagues who have done a lot of work in this area. Dr. Karina Walters for one, and also Dr. Alex Wilson, who first provided me with education on what Two-Spirit is. And from what I understand, it was adopted at the 1990 Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian Conference in Winnipeg, but it's a placeholder. As my colleague, Dr. Wilson, told me, it's not meant to be taken literally. It's not meant to be for every tribal community. I mean, we have hundreds upon hundreds of different cultures and ways of viewing gender and talking about our relationships with each other, but it was meant as a place for others to go back to their tribally specific terms and to be more inclusive of gender diversity. So with WNISCA and the center that we were trying to build, we wanted to talk about gender rebalancing and actually work with Dr. Wilson. She was a co-PI on the center, or still is, I should say, but also integrating land-based healing, because we really believe that the two go hand in hand. And when we think about conducting transformative community engaged research, we really thought about doing this in a way that was Indigenous and relevant to the Indigenous communities in which we served. And with that, gender rebalancing made the most sense for us. Now, this is a Choctaw perspective. So again, I'll give that caveat. My colleagues who are not Choctaw or even other Choctaws may have different views of this. But I always saw this as a way in which you have feminine, you have masculine, and then you have tapakoli, or the process of being in the middle. So as we think about gender, I've seen it culturally as a process. We may identify more with one or another, or my relatives may say they're definitely over here with the teak, the female. Other ones may say they're definitely over here with the nukni, with the males. Others may be more in the middle place. And that middle place is tapakole, and that none of these genders would exist without the other. So that's really important for me when I think about gender rebalancing. And as I talked with my Cree relatives and my Anishinaabe relatives in Canada, and Dene relatives, we came to the same conclusion that when we think about wellness and well-being, especially around how we're going to interact with one another to promote health, we really felt like gender rebalancing needed to occur first. And that meant decolonizing the ways that we saw gender, decolonizing what it meant to be female, decolonizing what it meant to be male, decolonizing what it means to operate within our gender roles, but also thinking about those gender roles in terms of our ancestral knowledges and in terms of our environment and Mother Earth, who is there. She is our sacred mother, right? And we know that she's come under attack through the oil and gas, for instance. That's a major issue on many people's minds, but as well as overall environmental pollution and contamination. And so as we think about how she's being mistreated, we also see the parallel, right, to Indigenous women and how they're being mistreated as well, and how women were relegated, Indigenous women in particular, as not being the leaders, not talked to, not being given the space within Western society to be who they could be, but also being relegated to these very contrived gender roles. And so with that, we talked about how we could get to this balancing site. And we formed an advisory council of elders and wisdom keepers across Canada and the US, actually. And we talked with them at how we can have this rebalancing occur in order to address these high HIV rates within the community. And we decided that this was really a community effort. We needed to get back to that ancestral focus, and we needed to break down colonization, right? So many times through colonization, Indigenous communities and knowledge systems have been fragmented. They've been removed from the land, removing Indigenous people from the land, first through massacres and genocidal attacks, and then removing us through physical removal from our sacred sites, and which holds our knowledges, and then removing us from our practices, our spirituality, right? And so we needed to break the cycle. And to do so, my colleague, Dr. James Makokis, often references coming in his talks. And so for him, as a two-spirit man, he talks about we really need to stop saying coming out, but coming in back into the circle and living and being seen as part of the community. And I think, that was really important for us as I worked with Dr. Wilson and Dr. King and Dr. Jennings and others on our center, is not thinking of genders as separated, not removed, but that we wouldn't be without the other. And that's all genders within our cycle of living and life and knowledge and roles. Oh, and I'll just say I have a Choctaw Deer woman. This is actually a mask that was found outside of Alabama or Louisiana in the swamps, and it's a cedar mask. And I really appreciate this mask because as a child growing up in Oklahoma and then around hunters and knowing deer, deer woman was seen as a figure to be feared, right? So you would go out as teenagers, say, oh, watch out for deer woman. You'll see this beautiful woman walk in, but when she walks around, she'll leave hoof prints in the sand. So if you're at a powwow or something, watch out for her. And I say, why do we watch out for her? What's she going to do? Like, oh, she stomps on men and kills them. She lures them off to the forest and stomps on their testicles and kills them and leaves them there. I'm like, oh, okay, interesting. Well, anyway, as I was doing well, first of all, I would see the images and I say, okay, that's really interesting because if you know deer, you know that female deer do not have horns. So I was like, oh, it's a transgender deer. That's interesting. But then I was like, well, why would she stomp on men's testicles? It's really interesting. But as I went on, I learned how deer woman for our tribal community actually brought the corn to Choctaw people from her loins. And she also would call the animals back and forth. So she's very much connected to Mother Earth. And she calls the animals back and forth upon their migrations. She takes care of us. And she's a very loving and important spiritual figure for us. So I can understand why she'd be relegated into this very negative archetype, right? And as I thought about it more, I was like, oh, well, through colonization, I imagine that it was hard for the missionaries and others who came to our communities to hear the story of dear woman who has horns and obviously is not physically, biologically perhaps born a female deer, but identifies as a female deer. And so for them, it could be that then it became basically demonized in our communities. And then I had an elder tell me, well, of course she stomps on men's testicles. It's when they're being objectifying of women. Her role was to come in and to stop any sexual assaults, to stop any men who may be behaving in that way. And the consequence of, rape or sexual assault in our community was always death, right? Of the men or some other form of punishment taken on by the women. So they said, well, that would be appropriate. So, I mentioned that because again, it's about coming in and it's about all of us, coming back in, not holding on to these toxic stereotypes of what it means to be a woman or a man and to be in this camp or that camp, but to actually understand that we all can't be without each other. And it's about us coming back in and rebalancing together and acting appropriately and reestablishing those roles, that respect, and that sacredness of being in a cycle together. Now, to do so, we definitely need decolonial public health research or health research in general. We need to address systemic racism, colonialism, ethnocide, institutions, et cetera. We need to address prejudice and racism and unconscious racism. And, mascots, this is a new documentary, Imagining the Indian, that's about mascots, but standing together to do so, right, and taking a stand. And so for me, I really hope and I really see my research as my form of activism. I have cousins who are at the protest lines, getting rubber bullets and tear gas and what have you with their families. I have amazing relatives doing great work. And, for whatever reason, I tended to excel at reading and loved it. So, I'm trying to find my way in the work that I do each and every day, trying to make sure that it makes a difference. And I'm hoping what I do can help address some of these needs for our research efforts. And I think as we think about it, right, we think about trauma and love, and a lot of the research is focused on trauma. And trauma is important because it can have long-lasting effects in our lives, right? But it's also similar as love because it's enduring. And I've given these talks about land-based healing and love, and I've had especially medical providers say, well, okay, so I understand trauma, but what the heck is love? And what do you mean by love? And as I say, you know it when you feel it, right? Like there's really no way to say, I'm going to quantify the trauma that you experienced. We know certain instances that would bring that about, but you know it when you feel it when someone suffers from it. But we also know love, and we know the type of experiences that come about from love. That's my grandmother with her oldest there. And we know that familial love and that enduring love that connects the generations past, present, and future. And that's felt just as deeply as trauma is. And we know that it can turn off these switches that get turned on through trauma. We know that it can heal someone. We know that it can reduce addiction risk. We know it can reduce, HIV risk, other chronic disease risks. And we know that love is also affected by past, present, and future generations. So I think that's really important as we think about our research that we want to do, as we think about how we're moving to heal and to remain in a place of balance. We really need to think about how we can do that in loving ways. And in particular, we know that transformation is needed, right? So we've had a lot of trauma. As a clinical health psychologist, I work with a lot of people who've had a lot of trauma, but it's about really transforming those narratives. It's about transforming how we see that. Instead of looking at how our ancestors have struggled and gone through these oppression, gone through these very difficult events, that we look at the strength that they had. And each time that I've worked with communities in Canada and New Zealand and the US, and we've researched their ancestor stories as they went through traumatic events. And each time they will write about the love of their future generations. In fact, one of my relatives wrote about carrying at 9, having to walk the Trail of Tears, barefoot in the snow. Her feet were bleeding, but she carried her little brother, who's 5, on her back the entire time, because she knew if she put him down, he would be harmed. He would be killed by the military who were with them. And so she carried him. And she said what got her through was not the fear of just the death of him or anything, or the death of herself, but she carried him because of the love. And she talked about she loved him so much, and the 7 generations forward from them, that she was willing to endure this walk. She was willing to take each step, and each step she thought about love, and each step kept her going through that love and reconnecting with that love. And I think as we think about Apanakvila and what she went through as well in that story, the teachings there are getting back to the love, because it is transformative. When we can look at what we've endured, but focus on our strengths during that time that got us through, going back to those ancestors and how they went through all of that for us through the love. And that's really important. And I think through Western research, a lot of times, we see trauma as harsh. We see it as masculine. It's valid. It's scientific. We know we can deal with it. And that's something we should do for social justice. And yes, we need to be aware of the trauma because it does have long-lasting effects. But we also need to leave space for love, even though it's seen as soft and feminine, because we need to get back to that gender rebalancing of seeing love as just as important as trauma, or even more so, right? And that it's not invalid or non-scientific, but it's actually very valid as well. And that it may even be far more powerful. In fact, I would say it's more powerful than trauma for sure, because it can reverse the effects of trauma. And so that's really critical for us to know. And at the same time, how do we get back to that love, right? And that loving place? And I would say that's through relationality with Mother Earth, through making those relationships again, going back to the first mother, going back to the feminine, going back to that loving place, because I do believe we heal bidirectionally from Mother Earth. That we not only are healed from her, but that she can also be healed. And through our stories, or talk to us stories too, even around gardening and walking on the earth, we know that that's important for her as well, to make the ground sacred again after times of trauma. Now, through loving research, I believe that we can decolonize, we can indigenize, and then we can have thrivance or thriving. And I really think we've reached a point today that we can have a lot of thrivance because we have wonderful Indigenous researchers. When I was going through, back in the day of going through school, I was still being told outright, be sure you don't focus on anything Indigenous. You have to do that on the side. You've got to do real research first if you expect to get through or expect to get tenure. Well, luckily I had great role models and I didn't have to do that. I did do twice the work, doing secondary data research, as well as, working with community work to keep things going. But at the same time, I really try to focus on this thrivance, right? Reaching a place where we can thrive and live well and focus on our strengths and the future generations. And I think that's really important as we move forward. Now, as we reclaim these narratives, Indigenous communities must be in control, right? So we've got to make sure that the Indigenous communities are telling their stories. And when I work with other Indigenous communities, even as an Indigenous researcher, I can't tell them, oh, that's colonial, you need to decolonize that. Or I think that was because of colonization that it came into effect. I mean, that's just not okay, right? You still have to be respectful of their views, of course, but they have to drive that. They have to be able to discuss. And that's where we have focus groups and elders and knowledge keepers coming together, discussing what works for them and what do they see as indigenizing? What do they see as important? And how is that important to them? Now, again, for myself, I do a lot of this through land-based healing, which just really means reconnecting to the land and centering land in order to conduct healing or health interventions. This has been really amazing in Western science. I'd say it's just catching up on this. So you see a lot of researchers in Japan in particular, but other areas looking at how going outside, touching the earth or being out in the sun can be extremely helpful and healthful, actually. We also think about trauma and place, right? So some of the work that I do focuses on going back to sites of trauma and healing in those sites, because those sites are viewed as a place that has ancestral embodiment, that, it's a placeholder for where the ancestors experienced this trauma. But it's also a place where you can connect the past, present, and future, to where you can get back in touch with the medicines that they ate, with the ground that they touched, with the waters that passed through them, right? And it connects you to a larger network with Mother Earth and our universe, which is really important. We do several walks within, well, I shouldn't say walks, they're actually healing camps within Canada. We have a couple going on right now in which we're working with youth and adults and taking them out on the land to the sacred sites and measuring how this affects them psychologically, improves their mental health and well-being, but also looking at physiological measures and what going outside can do for them in healthy ways, and how long do they need to go outside to get these benefits, right, with Mother Earth. Because some of the places in Canada are, of course, very cold. So and not everyone can take off work in the middle of summer. So we're examining that. I've also done a bit of work with Aotearoa and looking at how Indigenous women there, the Maori there, can heal from other sites of trauma in which they experienced. And then also working with my own Choctaw Nation community and the United Homa Nation and rewalking their trails of trauma. Homa Nation would be more canoeing and walking, and seeing how they could heal from trauma, again, transforming those narratives into hope and resilience and strength with my colleague, Dr. Karina Walters. Now, what we know, and I think what our ancestors have always known, right, is that getting outside is important. I remember making my baby's moccasins, my first child, and I beaded them. It's the first time I made brain tan hide moccasins and put so much love into those moccasins and beadwork and made them just look so gorgeous for me and what I can do. But I remember going to put them on her feet, and my partner says, who's Anishinaabe as well, said, you gotta poke a hole through them. And I said, I'm not putting a hole through these moccasins. I just made them. They're beautiful. It's brain tan hide. She's going to have these forever. Like, why would I put a hole through the bottom? It's like, well, she also has to always touch Mother Earth. So her feet have to touch the earth. So you have to put a hole. And as I started asking around my elders and looking more into it, I found out that Choctaws had a similar belief, right? That going outside and touching Mother Earth is good for us. And it's important for children to be connected to her from day one. So our ancestors knew this. And now we know as well, Western researchers have found, oh, lo and behold, this is good for you. It increases your chemicals in your brain to touch the Mother Earth. It increases those good feeling neurotins and serotonins just as well, if not better, than SSRIs or other antidepressants. Going outside 20 minutes a day can be so healthy for anyone who suffers from anxiety or depression. It also decreases blood glucose levels, especially when you think about diabetes type 2 being a stress-related disease. That's really important, as well as decreases our cortisol stress in our body. It also removes us from our daily stressors. So actually, if I was talking to you and you're outside right now, you're more likely to remember what I'm saying and to make health behavior changes based on it if you're outside. And that's what we see time and time again with research. We also know, though, that it gets us back in touch with Mother Earth. And when we talk about gender rebalancing and loving ways of being, I think it's really important that we get back to Mother Earth to keep us grounded, but to also reconnect and to be able to be mindful in a sense that, my grandmother would always take me outside and tell me to stop, look, listen, what do I see? And I say, oh, green leaf. She goes, no, what color green? I had to describe the shades, the hues. I had to talk about what I heard at that moment. What I smelled, right? All of those things are really important. And I didn't realize it at the time, but she was teaching me to be mindful in a sense in our Indigenous ways, to be outside, to be with Mother Earth, and to get back in touch, which I think is really important. I'm not going to go too much into that because I know I want to have time for questions and to discuss a little bit since we're a smaller group, but you may have heard about Yopoly, and I've been working with Dr. Walters for this for quite a while. I think we've gone on 9 different walks with the Choctaw Nation, rewalking our ancestral paths. And that was my eldest daughter, who is now 22 and doing a master's program in public health as well, working on MMIW and reducing violence against Indigenous women. And then for this project, we really have built in a lot of behavioral skills. Motivational interviewing is one, but really grounded it in Choctaw ways of being, right? We look at increasing physical activity, healthful food habits, lowering substance abuse risk, but really getting people back in touch with Mother Earth and with being Choctaw and what that means for them, right? So decolonizing how we view health. It's not about calories in, calories out, and exercising, a certain amount of time to get those calories. It's really about what is our relationship with Mother Earth? What is our relationship with each other as Choctaw people? And how do we need to take responsibility for this gift of being part of the community, right? And to being someone that our ancestors dreamt about, to being someone that they sacrificed for and that they got through such hardship for us to be here today. So what is our responsibility now to the future generations? And through this project and several others, we're really seeing communities joining with others, the solidarity, some community members. So we do a health promotion leadership framework with Yopoly. We give women a certain amount of money at the end of the walk. They go on the walk. They first do as a group sessions, and they go on the walk for 10 days, 7 to 10 days, camping out, some of them for the first time. They eat fresh fruits and vegetables, some of them for the first time. They talk about being Choctaw and what that means to do, what a Choctaw health framework is. And then they have some money to do a community project to help promote health within their communities in which they live. And some of that's been seminars, some of that's been walking groups, hiking groups, gardens, container gardening, and other grassroots initiatives. But all in all, I think as we reflect on this, especially at the United Home and Nation and my Canadian partners as well, and in New Zealand, we see land as really ceremony. It's an integral part of ceremony. We need to fracture these colonial thoughts. And the best way to do that is to go out on Mother Earth, right? We get so trapped in some of these ideas of we can't do this, we can't do that. I don't know my ancestral ways. I hear a lot of Indigenous community members say, well, I don't know. It was lost. And we say, well, first of all, it wasn't lost, it's systematically stolen. You didn't lose your language. You didn't lose your stories. You didn't lose your ceremonies. They were systematically stolen through colonization, through the US government, through the Canadian government, etc. So how do we reclaim those and revitalize those? And I think through going out on Mother Earth is when we start to remember that ancestrally. We start to look back. How did our ancestors do that? How did they reconnect? How did they heal? This is our time to be mindful and prayerful and to go out and to revitalize. But it's first taking us getting back in touch with that love upon Mother Earth and really drawing from that love as a source of inspiration and to heal and to move forward. Throughout this work, Yopoly has inspired so much. And in particular, we have 3 questions we ask. What kind of ancestor did my ancestors envision me to be? What kind of ancestor do I want to be? And what kind of ancestor do I want or envision future generations to be? And I think all in all, we have to think about we're all future ancestors in the making right now, right here. And so all of us, regardless of our cultural background or our degrees of identity or what we're doing, we all will become ancestors to the future generations. And I don't mean that as just if you have kin or you have relatives, but I mean the generations coming after us will look at us as their ancestors. And so now it's up to us to take responsibility to decide how we want to be seen and how we want to behave, and what responsibility do we have to the past generations who have gone before us, and what responsibility do we have to the future generations that will come after us. This is the Homa Nation women. They were just fabulous that I've worked with. Again, we did walking, we did canoeing. They had their men actually come out and support the women as well when we were on our journey in Louisiana. They developed a health framework that was really important for them in balancing who they are today in terms of health, right? You have spirituality, you have ceremony, you have land, water, place, and body. And this is all very important for them, especially this contemplative practices and increasing cultural continuity and identity, and having health promotion leadership within the community. But I think, all in all, when we know we get out in the land, we can induce these shifts, right? So when we got on an ancestral place, we can think about what our ancestors envisioned for us when we're outside on the earth. We can feel the earth, we can smell the earth, we can see our kins that are all around us. And it instigates also this need and responsibility to the lands, to care for the grounds, to care for the waters, to care for the trees. Because as most Indigenous communities will say, you can't be healthy without the land around you being healthy, right? So it takes two as we move forward. I think, as I think about land-based healing, and I was very thrilled to join the University of Washington, of course, and thrilled to be here to be able to focus on land-based healing through the division at Erie and environmental health. But I think it also gives us so much more opportunity, right, to break out of the clinic setting. As a health psychologist, you expect to work in the hospital or the clinic. And I even ran talking circles, like culturally modified interventions, right, with Indigenous communities and in clinics, but in a dark room with no windows, right? And as I think about this, I think how odd, because culturally we should be outside. We should be on the earth. We see that even being treated outdoors is so much more healthy, medically speaking. You can do outdoor treatment that produces better outcomes than indoor treatment. But we know that also getting back in touch with the land and being outside can help us determine those gender roles, can see the world. We have grandfather, sun, and grandmother moon, Mother Earth. We can talk about what that means for us to operate as a society and as part of the whole. We can also retrieve those ancestral instructions through those ancestral practices that occurred upon the land. A lot of communities have begun to re-engage in fasting and prayer, in ceremonies upon the land to revitalize their cultural traditions and to get back to those places before colonization took those ideas away, right? Before they stole those knowledge systems from Indigenous communities. And all in all, I think I just want to leave us with thinking about, love as a praxis, as your overall research approach and what that means. And I think love is synonymous with land-based healing, with earth, with our mother, as we think about our mother. And Choctaw, the word is holo, which means this deep, enduring love that crosses generations, past, present, and future. And that's embodied within women, within their wombs. And so their monthly cycles, we call it holo, because again, it's that love, right? It's that sacredness that connects all of us as we move through. So we think about that, and how can we conduct loving research, right? And how can we do research in which we consider ourselves part of the whole? We don't categorize people. We don't put them in boxes and say they're separate than us, right? And we have nothing to do with them, but we think about ourselves as a society, as a whole. I mean, even as an Indigenous person, I'm part of this whole society. I'm part of everyone happening on the earth right now. And we're part of the universe together, right? And so it's that love that's so important to tie us together, to give us responsibilities to take care of each other, and then to move upon that love. And then, of course, to use our research, our loving research as activism, to create change, to create transformation. And as Guru says, a hopeful transformation is what we're going for, to think about loving ethics, working for a collective good. I know Flickr has written about research being done in a good way is really important in Indian country. And I think that's very true, but I would reframe that to say research being done in a loving way. That's critical if we want to actually make sustaining change across generations and within our interventions. We really have to focus on love guiding us ethically and in our approaches with one another. I think all in all, as we think about thrivance, Dr. Walters and I have really tried to hash this out in a new article that we've written together. It was a lot of fun thinking about thrivance as love as well. If we think about ourselves excelling in the future and being healthy, I mean, the majority of Indigenous people around the world are healthy, and that's just fact, right? So the majority have been able to protect or to steal back their language and their ancestral knowledges and their ways of being. And that's really important as we talk about those original instructions guiding our wellness. Relational restoration back to community, having narrative transformation, and ceremony of spirituality. I mean, as we think this through, this idea of thrivance, it's here, it's upon us. And as researchers, how are we going to support that? As academics or as we learn more, how can we as a society at large support thrivance within Indigenous communities? And again, keep saying it, I really think land-based healing is key to that. I think it helps make thrivance possible, but it's also about creating a new place. And the thing I like about decolonization is that it kind of clears the way, right? Like a Patnakvila. So I think about a Patnakvila coming in, this tornado whirlwind that comes in, and it clears the place. And did you know, just anecdotally, I was looking, so majority of tornadoes occur around pipelines or fracking areas within the US. And so I have to think about that spiritually, right? Is that because those areas of high pollution, environmental contamination, is that a Panakpila, as our stories say, going through and clearing and trying to rebalance the land, or call our attention back to what's being done to Mother Earth. And I think that's really important as we think about clearing this. And what do we want to rebuild once that's been cleared? How do we want to treat Mother Earth once she's been cleared? Do we want to get back to the balancing, or do you want to stay out of balance? Because I think to do so, it's really about disrupting that colonial lens as we move forward. And remembering we're all part of the collective, remain aware of what you carry. I think any little effort that we make is important, because over time, our ripples will be felt by all as we move forward and go through. So even today, you can start creating ripples. I'm sure all of you already have, but being mindful that whatever we do puts into motion across generations, which is really important. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to chat.